What's going on, guys? TCG Guide here, and this is a video that has been a long time coming. So back before I took my break from YouTube, I kept saying that I was going to do an archetype analysis on Predaplants, but I never got around to it. But that's gonna change now. So Predaplants, or predator plants as they're known in the OCG, are an archetype of vicious plants ready to dominate and fuse with your monsters. Taking advantage of their predator counters is definitely the key to victory here, but should you rely on this invasive species to win the duel? Let's find out. Well, starting things off for the archetype is Predaplant Cordyceps. Cordyceps is a level 1 with 0 attack and 0 defense, so not too great of a start here. Cordyceps doesn't even have an effect on the field. The only way to use Cordyceps is from the graveyard, and even then its effect is really lackluster. If Cordyceps is in the graveyard during your standby phase, you can banish it to target and special summon 2 level 4 or lower Predaplant monsters from your graveyard. Then for the rest of your turn, you can't normal summon and you can't special summon either, except fusion monsters. The one interesting thing about this effect is that it doesn't limit you to special summoning the fusion monsters from the extra deck. You can still pull fusion monsters from the graveyard if you have a way to do so. I guess it is worth noting too that the monsters you special summon with this effect don't get their effects negated. So there is some potential for Cordyceps, but that cap is pretty low and I'd keep this one down to 1 if you choose to run it at all. Next is Predaplant Saracenian, and this level 1 actually does quite a bit. For starters, if your opponent declares a direct attack, you can special summon Saracenian from your hand to protect you from the attack. What's more though is that after damage calculation, if Saracenian battled, you can destroy the monster it battled. That's not all though. When Saracenian is destroyed by battle or sent to the grave by card effect, you can add a Predap card from your deck to your hand, except Saracenian. Now that search is a hard once per turn and it's pretty slow, but that's the only thing that's really limiting about Saracenian's effect. Its stat line is really low, so whatever it battles is going to take it out, but you can still force your opponent to attack differently or not at all if you use a well-timed Saracenian. This is one that I love to see, and I'd say is a solid 3 of in any Predaplant deck. Here's where you can start to see what the deck is really capable of. Predaplant Flytrap is the first of the level 2s, and it's also the first card on this list that can put predator counters on your opponent's monsters. It does this as a soft once per turn, by the way, and if a monster that gets a predator counter is level 2 or higher, it becomes level 1. What's really important to know about this effect is that predator counters don't do anything on their own. Just because a monster has a predator counter on it doesn't automatically make it have a lower level. That's actually part of Flytrap's effect. That said, with the way that cards that place predator counters on monsters are worded, as long as the counter stays on it, it will have its level lowered. They could make this a little more clear by giving them an errata and adding in, even if this card leaves the field, but that's beside the point. Getting back to Flytrap and why that little diversion was necessary, at the start of the damage step, when Flytrap battles a monster with an equal or lower level, you can destroy that monster and then increase Flytrap's level by that monster's original level. I don't think I need to tell you just how broken this effect can get. If you thought that FA got their levels up fast, Flytrap has something to say about that. This is one you should keep at least 2 of in your deck, but more than likely you'll want to be running 3. Predaplant Squid Drosera is the next card in the lineup, and it seems like it could be really good at a glance. You can send it from your hand to the graveyard to make one of your monsters able to attack each of your opponent's monsters with a predator counter, which isn't bad. I mean, just think about how big Flytrap would get if you used this on it. The problem is, it's hard to get a bunch of predator counters out at one time. Oh, but Squid is here to help. If it was face up and leaves the field, you can place a predator counter on each of your opponent's special summon monsters. And if you do, the ones that were level 2 or higher become level 1. The big problem with that is trying to get it off at the right time. On the first turn, it does exactly nothing. On turn 2 or after, it could be used for a pretty good effect, but that would eat your normal summon. And yes, the Predaplant engine can special summon this from the deck, but you'd have to normal summon Ophrys Scorpio for that. This one is really a personal choice, but I'd say run either 0 or 2. If you run it, you'll want to see it before too long, even if it is just to get 2 attacks. Finishing off the level 2s is Predaplant Clamata Sundew, who's here to let you know that it's okay if Konami bans Super Poly again, because Predaplant players will have it on legs. So for starters, any monsters you use as fusion materials with the Predator counter on them are considered to be dark. That's great because all Predaplant fusion monsters require a dark monster in one way or another. But of course, Sundew's main use is its once per turn effect that lets you fuse using it and monsters on the field, in your hand, or monsters your opponent controls with Predator counters on them. That is a hard once per turn, but that's really not a problem, especially since the only restriction is that it has to be a dark fusion monster. It doesn't even limit the amount of materials like some other fusion cards out there. This is easily a 3 of in every Predaplant deck. So earlier I mentioned the Predaplant engine. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it by now, but for those of you that don't know, it starts with this card, Predaplant Ophrys Scorpio. When Ophrys Scorpio is normal or special summoned, you can discard a monster from your hand to special summon a Predaplant monster from your deck. This is a really good effect, and most of the time you'll be summoning this next card. Predaplant Darlingtonia Cobra. When Darlingtonia Cobra is special summoned by the effect of a Predaplant monster, you can add a Polymerization spell card or a Fusion spell card from your deck to your hand. When these two are used together as an engine in most decks, you'd be searching for Brilliant Fusion. But in a Predaplant deck, you've got a ton of options. There are your obvious ones like Polymerization, Fusion Sub, and Instant Fusion, but you can also get cards like Super Poly, Ultra Poly, Fusion Conscription, Fusion Recovery, and the list goes on. These two cards had a ton of potential in the right decks, but what really holds it back is the fact that you can only use Darlingtonia Cobra's effect once per duel. So with that in mind, you'll want to run the engine at 3 and either 1 or 2. You need 3 Ophrys Scorpio to be sure that you see it, but you want as little Cobra as possible, and I only say run 2 because it can be used as a fusion material or as a discard if one copy ends up in your hand. Predaplant Pentas is the last of the level 3s, and honestly, I was really surprised with how much I ended up liking it. With its stats so low, only 300 attack and 2100 defense, I thought for sure I'd never be able to make use of it. But after playing a few games with Pentas, I was blown away with how useful it was. For starters, if it inflicts battle damage to your opponent, you can target a monster they control and put a Predator counter on it. That's what I thought would be impossible. But people actually attacked into it face down way more than I would have expected, letting me get that easy counter out. But the really fun part of using Pentas was taking my opponent's monsters with him, since if your opponent controls a monster with an equal or lower level, you can target it and take control of it. What's even better though, is if you've been able to keep Predator counters out, this is a soft once per turn effect, meaning if you have 2 Pentas out, and you've done some level modification on a couple bigger monsters, you can really change the game in your favor. Overall, I'd say keep this one at 2 or 3 copies. It does have great potential and good utility, but it might not be something you'll want to open with. Next up is the Archetype's Beat Stick, and that's Predaplant Moray Nepenthes. This is another one of those cards that would be great if only there was a way to get a bunch of Predator counters out quick. It starts off with 1600 attack and 1000 defense, which isn't bad for a level 4 but isn't really good either. But it also gains 200 attack for each Predator counter on the field, which means that at most in a one-on-one game you can get this up to 2800 attack. That's if and only if your opponent has a full field and you can get Predator counters on each of their monsters. If you can get that to happen, this card is actually pretty great. If you get it up to a decent attack and destroy an opponent's monster by battle with it, then you can equip that monster in Moray Nepenthes, and once per turn you can target and destroy a monster equipped to Moray Nepenthes to gain life equal to that monster's attack. The life points honestly don't make that much of a difference in most games, but just the fact that it keeps monsters from activating their effects that trigger when they get sent to the graveyard by equipping it is enough to make this card worth it. But with all that in mind, this is one you might be better off cutting from your list altogether. On the other hand, Predaplant Spinodionea is one that you always want access to. Its attack is only a little bit higher than the Pentas, but that 200 makes all the difference in battle. Not only does it have a leg up in its stats, but its effect is also hand over fist better. For starters, when it's normal or special summoned, you can target a face-up monster your opponent controls and put a predator counter on it. Just that alone is better than the Pentas, but it doesn't stop there. After damage calculation, if Spinodionea battled a monster with an equal or lower level, you can special summon a Predaplant monster from your deck other than Spinodionea. Not only does it set up for its own effect, but it's also the only other way to special summon a Predaplant from the deck. I know this is really only relevant when it comes to Darlingtonia Cobra, but it's still important to know. Predaplants don't have a whole lot of high level monsters in the main deck, but what they do have can be pretty terrifying. Predaplant Drosophilum Hydra is a level 5 who really shows what a Hydra does best. If Drosophilum Hydra is in your hand or graveyard, you can special summon it by tributing a monster your opponent controls with a predator counter on it, which is great, especially since even when you can't special summon it from the graveyard, you can still get some use out of it. Once per turn, you can banish a Predaplant monster from your graveyard to make an opponent's monster lose 500 attack. You can do that as a quick effect too, so don't forget about it when your opponent goes for one of your fusion monsters that's not Chimera Flesia. Another thing to remember with this effect is that you can use it on the field too, so it's not just useful in the grave. With all that in mind, I would still only run 1 or 2. Lastly, for the main deck monsters is Predaplant Banksy Ogre. Banksy Ogre has an effect similar to Hydra's special summoning effect, but you have to have Banksy Ogre in your hand to summon it. That's really where the similarities stop. Banksy Ogre's other effect is more to spread the love that is predator counters, because doesn't everyone just love them by now? If Banksy Ogre gets sent from the field to the graveyard, that's when its effect activates, putting a predator counter on each face-up monster your opponent controls, and they all become level 1 if any of them are level 2 or higher. That's not an optional effect either, so don't forget about it if you're running it. That said, it is a little less summonable than Hydra, and its effect only activates when it leaves the field. And yes, it is a tuner, so it can be fused, synchroed, or linked away, but I still say at most you should only run 1. Predaplants don't have a whole lot of options when it comes to spells and traps, so what it does have, it has to put to good use. If you've ever had to deal with weeds while doing yard work, you know that one of the things they can be especially good at is the comeback. Just like all strong weeds, Predaponics is here to make sure that your Predaplants don't stay gone for too long. Once per turn with this, you can special summon a level 4 or lower Predaplant monster from your hand or graveyard, but it gets its effects negated. That's really not too bad of a drawback, but it does really suck that you can't get 2 uses out of Flytrap or Spinodionea. But I get why that might not be such a good thing. But that's not the only drawback with this method of cultivation. Once per turn during the standby phase, you do have to pay 800 life points or destroy the card. There are a couple of redeeming qualities about that cost though, believe it or not. First and most importantly, it's optional. Sure, if you want to keep it up, then you'll have to pay the 800. But if all you wanted to do was special summon another monster to link or fuse with, then just destroy Predaponics. Secondly, it's pretty slow all things considered. Even if you do actually decide to pay to keep it on the field, you don't have to do that until your next turn. This is one you should probably keep between 1 or 2 copies. It's searchable when you need it, and it tends to get bricky at 3. Predapruning, on the other hand, is another way to keep your Predaplants coming back. Just target a Predaplant monster in the graveyard, special summon it, and equip it with Predapruning. It's as simple as that. If Predapruning leaves the field though, your Predaplant gets destroyed too. That's the only drawback though. You don't have to pay life points to use it, you don't have to worry about your monster's effect getting negated, and probably the most important thing is that it doesn't limit the monster's level. Yes, the vast majority of Predaplant monsters in the main deck are low level, but they do have some in the main deck, and the lowest level for their fusion monsters is 7, so there is definitely a little more utility there. Even if it can only get 1 monster at a time, it more than makes up for that by not restricting what you can get with it. This is a solid 3 of in any Predaplant deck. The last of the spells is a card that I really never thought I'd get the chance to talk about on the channel. But thanks to the wonderful set that is Soul Fusion, we finally have Predaplants at our disposal here in the TCG. Predaplants is by far the easiest way to get a lot of predator counters out in a hurry. You reveal any number of Predap cards in your hand, then target that many monsters your opponent controls and put a predator counter on each. That's not all though. Predaplants also gives your Predaplant some protection after you've used it. If a Predaplant monster you control would be destroyed by battle, you can banish Predaplants from the grave instead. This is an automatic 3 of. God, I'm so happy for Soul Fusion. Rounding off the main deck cards is Predaplanet. Predaplanet is easily your best searcher, even if it is a little slow. Once per turn as a hard once per turn. If a monster with a predator counter on it leaves the field while Predaplanet is face up, you can search any Predap card and add it to your hand. That's not all though. Of course your opponent is going to try and get rid of this as soon as possible, and when they do, they set you up for a fusion next turn as long as you can get the monsters you need either in your hand or on the field. Even with how good of a card this is for searching, at most I'd say run 2, but you're better off sticking to 1. And that's it for the main deck Predaplant cards. Moving right along to the extra deck, there are really only 3 Predaplant fusions, even though a 4th is always run right alongside the main 3. First up is Predaplant Chimeraplegia. Chimeraplegia is the level 7 dark plant monster that takes a Predaplant monster and a dark monster to make. Honestly, if this was level 8, it would be perfect, but even at level 7, it's still incredible. For starters, once per turn, you can target a monster with a level less than or equal to Chimeraplegia's and banish it. No mercy here. Your opponent won't be activating effects when it gets destroyed, they won't be activating effects when it goes to the grave even. Their monster just gets banished. And that's just the first of Chimeraplegia's 2-pronged attack strategy. Once that monster is out of the way and you go into battle, when an attack is declared involving Chimeraplegia and an opponent's monster, you can have that monster lose 1000 attack, and Chimeraplegia gains all that stolen attack power. Of course that only lasts until the end of the turn, but since it works when either player attacks, your opponent might think twice before trying to hit you. That's still not everything though. During the standby phase after it's sent to the graveyard, you can add a polymerization spell card or a fusion spell card from your deck to your hand. The important part about that effect is that it doesn't matter how Chimeraplegia gets in the grave. It doesn't even matter if it was on the field or not. The next fusion monster is another card that I never thought would see the light of day in the TCG. You know I'm talking about Predaplant Dragostapelia. This was the missing link for so long when it came to Predaplant fusion monsters, and now we can finally play with this awesome monstrosity. Like I mentioned with Chimeraplegia, level is pretty important, and Dragostapelia's level is right on the money at 8. Not only that, but it's dark too, which makes it absolute perfect fodder for the next fusion monster. But before I get too far ahead of myself, let's look at the other reasons why Dragostapelia is great. Until now, the only way to get Predaplant counters out as a quick effect was with Predaplast, which we also didn't have in the TCG. Well, that's great and all, but why does it matter if you can put counters out as a quick effect? Because as long as Dragostapelia is out, monsters with predator counters have their activated effects negated. That's why. It has 2700 attack, which isn't that great, but that effect is invaluable to Predaplants. Not to mention, Dragostapelia works great to make Greedy Venom Fusion Dragon if you want. And even though Greedy Venom might not be starving, it is still hungry. Once per turn, you can target a face-up monster, and until the end of the turn, change that target's attack to 0 and negate its effects. Oh, and if that wasn't enough for you, if it's destroyed and sent to the graveyard, destroy as many other monsters on the field as possible, then banish a level 8 or higher dark monster from your graveyard to bring Greedy Venom right back out. This is the bossest of boss monsters Predaplants ever could have asked for. But there is still one honorable mention, and that's Starving Venom Fusion Dragon. Sure, it's not a Predaplant, and it doesn't even require a Predaplant monster as material like Greedy Venom, but since it just requires dark monsters on the field, it works great as a fill-in for Dragostapelia with it being level 8 and dark. Its attack is actually a little better than Dragostapelia's, but just barely. What really separates the two though is the fact that this doesn't stop effects, it copies them, and is a soft once per turn no less. That's not all though. The turn it's fusion summoned, you can make it gain attack equal to one of your opponent's special summon monsters, and just like Greedy Venom Fusion Dragon, Starving Venom is an attack deterrent, since it lets you destroy all your opponent's special summon monsters if it gets destroyed. Obviously, as a fusion archetype, Predaplants have room to tech in lots of stuff. Poly and the rest of the fusion cards I mentioned earlier in the video, but especially Super Poly at as many copies as Konami will let you run, since fusing with your opponent's monsters is part of their gimmick anyway. Funnily enough, another highly anticipated import from Soul Fusion also works really well in Predaplants, Fright Fur Patchwork. Running 3 copies of Patchwork and 3 copies of Edge Imp Chain is actually a pretty big boon for this deck, since Patchwork searches an Edge Imp and a Poly. This gives you an easy fusion without using your normal summon, plus when Edge Imp Chain goes to the graveyard, you can search another Patchwork for next turn. Polynosis can be an amazing counter if you get a decent board built, since it requires you to tribute a plant type monster. But it is definitely worth it in most cases, since it stops normal or special summons or spell or trap activations. Since all of your fusions require a dark monster anyway, and you fuse with your opponent's monsters sometimes, Layer of Darkness might be a good option for a field spell, but I haven't tested that out at all. Feel free to try it out and let me know how it works. And as anyone who runs the Predaplant engine can tell you, you really can't go wrong with Lone Fire Blossom for consistency. For that, you might as well run a Soul Charge too, because there's nothing better than seeing the look on your opponent's face when you pop 3 Lone Fires just to get the Predaplant engine going, and then you search your fusion card. Play Soul Charge to bring back all 3 Lone Fires for even more fun. If done right, you can pretty easily end up with a Link plus Chimeraplegia and Starving Venom. Or you can just go for a turn 1 Greedy Venom or Dragostapelia, whichever you want. Live a little. Predaplants are a fun archetype overall, and if you don't mind a slightly slower playstyle, this might be something to check out, especially with the new support. But thank you so much for watching. I know this was a longer video than what I normally do, and this was also a very long time coming, but thank you for sticking with me. Also, a very special thank you to a Mr. Robert Bodo. I could not have done it without you. But if you liked the video, give it a like, and if you want to see more archetype analysis like this, subscribe and hit the bell to see when I upload a new video. I am working on more frequent content, but at least for now, check back next week for Metaphiz. I've also got a few deck profiles going up over the next couple of days, so be sure to watch out for those too. That's all for now, and as I always say guys, have a nice day.